This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
All right, well, welcome to the first of our seminars this year. And this is a very important seminar for a couple of reasons. This is a joint seminar between the history of sexuality and oral history. So that's a wonderful collaboration in the first place. It's also, for the History of Sexuality seminar, exactly the 1-year anniversary since our first seminar met last year. Exactly, hands in the air. So that's very exciting as well. In regard to that, the History of Sexuality seminar is convened by members of the Raphael Samuel History Center. And for anyone that's interested, I just want to pass around some brochures or some leaflets. They're not leaflets, they're these little pieces of information about the center. More is going to be coming around your way as well. There are sign-in books for both seminars that have to be signed and have to be recorded for the IHR, and our funding to some extent based on this as well. So we have to make sure to both seminars need to have the attendance recorded, particularly with such great combined attendance as this. So please do sign the books as they go round. There's 2 of them, and you'll need to sign both of them, please. It is also the anniversary of the seminar also extends to the anniversary of the History of Sexuality's associated blog, Notch's Remarks on the History of Sexuality, notchesblog.com if you want to take a look at it. And Amy is one of my co-editors on that, as is Julia. And we've got several people that have written for the blog, Carrie Hamilton, and we're going to be writing about Matt Cook before long, so looks up a little bit startled. So a number of us have been involved in that, and it's an anniversary of 1 year since we launched that today as well, so do please check that out. A little bit of housekeeping. The next History of Sexuality seminar is going to be January 27th, where when Professor Peter Hegarty of the University of Surrey speaks on the denaturalization of sexuality in 21st century psychology. So that's same room, time, but on the 27th of January. The next oral history seminar is the 5th of February, when Dr. Christine Wall from the University of Westminster will speak on constructing post-war Britain, building workers' histories 1950 to 1970. So both of those are upcoming, and information is on the IHR seminar's website as well. Finally, I'd like to invite any of you that are interested in joining us for dinner with Amy after the seminar. We have a reservation at the Marquis Cornwallis, just on Marchmount Street, just over by the Brunswick Centre, at 7:30. So just let me know when we're milling about afterwards if you'd like to join us, but anyone is welcome to attend for dinner with our guest.
Makes it sound like I'm going to be sitting like at the head of the table, like holding court, which I am.
I was going to say, you've already seen the setup, so. A little bit about Amy. Amy Tooth Murphy is an oral historian specializing in lesbian and queer oral histories and post-war lesbian history, with an emphasis on domesticity. Amy completed her PhD at the University of Glasgow, after which she was with the University of East London, coordinating the Bethnal Green Memorial Project, and is now a research associate on the Memoirs of Fiction Project at the University of Roehampton, using oral histories of readers to examine how reading shapes the lives and life narratives of individuals. Amy is an associate of the Raphael Samuel History Center, on the steering committee of Women's History Scotland, and an editor of the blog Notch's Remarks on the History of Sexuality. So do check out some of those things. And I'd like to welcome Amy to speak to us today on the continuous thread of revelation, chrononormativity, and the challenge of queer oral history.
Thanks, Justin. Realise I'm kind of speaking out into the hall now as well, but there's another seat here if anybody wants to sit in it. I thought we were going to have like a quiet ease into the new year, but you know, what can I do? By way of a disclaimer, I just followed Justin into the men's toilet, so that kind of shows my state of mind at the moment. I'm obviously not really paying very much attention. So that's an apology before we even start. I'm going to talk about some current work that I'm doing around queer oral history and some specific theoretical and methodological issues that I believe oral historians need to consider in undertaking this kind of oral history interviewing. Now, on the face of it, oral history appears to be the perfect discipline with which to get to LGBTQ voices and experiences. But as my research in this field has developed, I've been left with some questions about the extent to which this now is just being seen as fact rather than still being interrogated to make sure we're still on track. I believe the progress of queer theory challenges assumptions previously held about oral history's ability to foreground discourses of non-normative sexualities. And I realise, as Justin said, it's a mixed audience today since we've got a joint seminar going on, so I'm mindful that I'm talking towards two different areas of expertise. So if there's anything that's not clear, do let me know, and I've tried to cover my bases. And I'll do that by kind of setting the scene briefly by telling you the background of the work which has led to these theoretical musings which I'm going to force on you. My area of expertise is, as Justin has said, lesbian oral history and literature in post-war Britain. The post-war period is still a relatively under-researched area of lesbian history. Previous work in the field on lesbian history and lesbian literature has tended to focus on two pillars of the interwar period and lesbian feminism of the 70s and 80s. In my work, I've looked at literature as cultural production and at the ways in which literature informed and influenced identity formation and concepts of lesbian sexuality and the self. Current historiography of this period has tended to focus on lesbian public life, so the lesbian magazine Arena 3, for example, community formation, the bar scene, notably done by Rebecca Jennings and Emily Hammer, and of course Alison Oram. This has in some ways obscured the majority of women who were not involved in public life, although this is now becoming more and more to the fore. Through the focus on literature, I've also used that as a jumping off point to explore the role of domesticity in lesbian life, as Justin has said. This was, in a sense, a hidden discourse within a hidden discourse. And this issue of domestic life will be important to what I'm going to talk about today. And this has also been a very under-researched area of queer life more generally, although there have been some key pieces of work in the last few years that have gone a long way to beginning to rectify this gap, such as done by people that I can see in this audience that I won't refer to by name. It's always difficult when you end up having notes that refer to people that you're staring at. So that's the history of sexuality's context. Now for the oral history context. Be always mindful of this mixed crowd, as I say. It's probably not news to anyone that oral history was conceptualised as a tool in the move towards history from below. With a disclaimer for a massive generalisation, oral history has been seen as a particularly useful methodology in uncovering silenced and marginalised voices. Feminist theory has had a massive role in oral history's development in terms of challenging dominant discourse, grand narratives, the erasure of challenging the erasure of women's experiences, and of other minority groups. Feminist theory has also suggested that oral history can uncover things not preserved in the archive. And it's also been about challenging hegemonic and androcentric discourses. Anderson and Jack, quite some years ago now, in a really important study, urged us to learn to listen in stereo so that we could tune into a muted channel of what women want to say, are not saying, are trying to say. So far, so feminist. There have been a number of LGBTQ oral history studies in the UK, the US, Australia and elsewhere. And these studies have made use of oral history's specific set of commitments and ethical codes to attempt to resurrect LGBTQ narratives. This has also been timely. The gay rights movement, progress in equality, but the continued repression of LGBTQ people around the world, and increasing visibility of LGBTQ lives. From a historiographical and theoretical perspective, this has been a case of the right place at the right time. The early days of LGBTQ studies and LGBTQ history saw attempts to trace our heritage as LGBTQ people, to find ourselves in the past, if you will. Of course, this has come to be contested in the light of so-called post-identity and in Foucauldian rejections of labels such as homosexual being applied to anything pre-20th century. But nonetheless, oral history and LGBTQ studies found themselves at exactly the right moment. Going back to my research, oral history also seemed like a perfect tool to explore domestic narratives and uncover the experiences of women who were not participating in public life, going to lesbian bars, partaking in groups, or reading Arena 3 magazine. So onto oral history theory and methodology. I'm a self-confessed oral history geek, and as a feminist scholar, the theory and method of oral history has really spoken to me as being grounded within a feminist approach. Oral history, after all, champions subjectivity, intersubjectivity, the self-reflexivity of the researcher, nuance, subtlety, agency, ethical considerations about a research and its aims, consideration of power dynamics, and so on. I could talk about this all day, but I won't, I'll spare you that. But I do want to introduce some theoretical concepts that are key to this discussion. The main oral history theory I want to draw on is one that oral historians will almost certainly be familiar with, and it's Graham Dawson's theory of composure. Dawson developed this concept in his book Soldier Heroes, British Adventure, Empire and the Imagining of Masculinities, in which he interrogated concepts of masculinity in the soldier hero narrative. Dawson uses a play on the twofold meaning of composure to explain what happens in an oral history interview encounter. Firstly, the narrator composes a narrative in the sense that they construct a version of events in line with the questions posed by the interviewer. What's really useful about the use of this word is that it serves as a reminder of the act of creation that the narrator is involved in. This is not simply a rote set of facts and events. This is storytelling in the sense that the narrator is choosing what to tell and what not to tell. As all oral historians know, you'll never get the same interview twice. I don't have time to go into it too much here, but this is where intersubjectivity becomes important. The narrator will construct their narrative based on the questions they've been asked, what they think the interviewer wants to hear, what they think the intended audience wants to hear, what they themselves think is important, what they happen to remember through prompts on the day, and a whole range of other factors that could be as simple as what they had for breakfast. So this is a creative and organic process. Secondly, Dawson uses the term to explain that the narrative which is created in that interview is one with which the narrator is comfortable. Through telling their story, they become composed or at ease. They achieve composure. This is a version of the past which, in the telling, corroborates and reflects the self and identity they wish to present through the interview. This composed self is dependent not just on the narrator, but also on wider cultural discourses. In Dawson's work, he discusses how the soldier-hero narrative has such potency and cultural currency in discourses of war that soldiers need to be able to relate their own experience in keeping with this framework. In other words, the audience needs to hear what it expects to hear. If your experience does not fit the dominant cultural mode, then you're at odds with cultural memory. And in Dawson's work, this manifests as an inability on the part of soldiers and veterans to tell stories which undermine the concept of the soldier-hero. And of course, that basic concept I don't think is difficult to grasp. You may be familiar with the Anzac myth in Australian culture, in which the real lived experience of soldiers has been silenced by the sheer force of the dominant cultural narrative based on strength, stoicism, victory and triumph. So in brief, this second meaning of composure is all about the narrator being able to tell a story that they themselves are comfortable with, and, importantly, that makes sense to themselves as the person they now see, makes sense to themselves as the person they now see themselves to be, and that makes sense to the receiving audience. That audience has to be able to fit that narrative into their wider understanding. In my research, and in LGBT oral history generally, this often manifests in the form of the coming out narrative, and I'll come back to that later. In my own work, I've come to think of all this as the life equation. So in my research, I carry out life narrative interviews, long interviews where I encourage narrators to consider their life as a whole. I found that composure for my narrators meant A plus B plus C plus X plus Y plus Z equals me, the person that you see sitting in front of you today. Those integers could be events, realizations, relationships, whatever, but the point is that everything related in the interview was a piece of the jigsaw that was that person. It's as though in an interview the narrator marshals evidence drawn from their life to present the lesbian self sitting at that moment in the interview. And I want to bring in at this point a quote from the author Eudora Welty, when I also got the quote for the title for my talk, and I think it sums up the role that narrative and chronology play in all this. The events in our lives happen in a sequence in time, but in their significance to ourselves they find their own order, a timetable not necessarily, perhaps not possibly chronological. The time as we know it subjectively is often the chronology that stories and novels follow. It is the continuous thread of revelation. And you can see from Welty's quote that composure also depends on our sense of narrative. Of course, our sense of narrative is overwhelmingly powerful. It's a tool that human beings use to understand and order the world. We could go into plenty of narrative theory again, but we won't do that. Let's just throw out what Welty has to say about chronology. Oral historians will know that often in interviews a narrator puts events in an order that you know to be problematic from your historiographical knowledge. And this is not just a phenomenon of oral history. We've all had those moments in our day-to-day lives where we find it hard to believe that a certain amount of time has passed. Like when someone says, yeah, that was like 5 years ago, and you think, well, it can't possibly have been 5 years ago. Or when you're sure that a certain event happened before another one, but you know from the dates that just wasn't the case. Welty would argue that we find our own chronology that makes sense of an otherwise haphazard array of happenings that make up our lives. So these drives to find narrative and find chronology are extremely important in oral histories. That's not to say that narrators relay their stories completely based on a chronological progression. That type of interview is actually very rare, as people tend to jump around thematically in time, so that when a memory or topic is triggered, they'll divert to tell you about it. However, there's also, there tends to be a recognition from interviewees that this is perhaps the wrong way to do things. So an interviewee will say, oh, sorry, I'll go back to where I was, and seek to pick up that chronology again. Although it's proven to be very contentious, communication studies has posited that men and women narrate differently, and along gendered lines. Generally speaking, communication studies argues that women have a role as the keeper of domestic life. They tell certain stories of births, marriages and deaths, and that they do something which I think is quite interesting, which has been called pivoting the centre. So I'll start to tell a story about us being here today, and it will remind me of something about Justin, and then I'll tell you something about Justin, and then that will spin me off to say something else about Justin's husband, and then we'll have a conversation about that. And so it's constantly doing this kind of pivoting around. On the other hand, communication studies have said that men tell tales of personal autonomy, progress, achievement, a linear narrative where I is always at the centre. That sounds very essentialist, and that's why it's been contentious, but it doesn't necessarily have to be read as essentialist. If we think about it in terms of social construction of how people are taught to communicate and how they're expected to communicate, then I think we can more easily sit with that theory. So now I want to move into the concept of chrononormativity and the way in which it problematises oral history interviewing. Sorry for that long preamble, but it's kind of important to get those concepts that are underpinning this first. So the concept of chrononormativity belongs to Elizabeth Freeman, and it's something I've only recently sort of been dealing with. Although she does base her argument on a range of established concepts from anthropology, sociology and gender studies. And what Freeman's saying, I think, is pretty straightforward and obvious, but it is couched in quite theoretical language sometimes. In its essence, chrononormativity is about how we tend to understand time, the passing of time, and our own lives within that passing, through very hegemonic and heterocentric modes which privilege certain ways of being, and which give certain benchmarks which have to be attained in order to consider one's life successful. This would be chrononormative. Let's have a look at a couple of quotes from Freeman. Big enough, yeah. Sorry, they are kind of chunky, but as I say, she does tend to use fairly theoretical language. I'll try and run through this. Chrononormativity is a mode of implantation, a technique by which institutional forces come to seem like somatic facts. Schedules, calendars, time zones, and even wristwatches indicate what the sociologist Evita Zerobavo calls hidden rhythms, forms of temporal experience that seem natural to those whom they privilege. Manipulations of time convert historically specific regimes of asymmetrical power into seemingly ordinary bodily tempos and routines, which in turn organise the value and meaning of time. The advent of wage work, for example, entailed a violent retemporalisation of bodies once tuned to the seasonal rhythms of agricultural labour. So, in this section, she isn't talking specifically about queer people. Instead, in introducing the concept, she takes a Marxist perspective. But what you can see is that she's talking about enforcing ways of being and presenting them as natural, when in fact they're imposed ways of being which benefit the state and state ideologies. Moving through her argument, she introduces a related term, chronobiopolitics. Never one to say something when you can say it 5 times over. Chronobiopolitics. Teleological schemes of events or strategies for living, such as marriage, accumulation of health and wealth of the future, reproduction, child rearing, and death and its attendant rituals. Indeed, as the anthropologist John Boneman's work clarifies, so-called personal histories become legible only within a state-sponsored timeline. And so here we do find relevance for queer oral histories. The majority of these markers that she lists here are what we would associate with living a normally successful heterosexual life. And you can see the clear overlap with the concept of composure, in that, as Bornemann claims, personal histories are only legible, i.e. only composable in Dawson's words, within a state-sponsored timeline, within a dominant discourse which values these life events as markers on a road to success. To take it a step further and throw narrative back into the mix, and I promise this is the longest quote of the evening. I tried to cut it, but then... In the eyes of the state, this sequence of socioeconomically productive moments is what it means to have a life at all. And in zones not fully reducible to the state, in, say, psychiatry, medicine and law, having a life entails the ability to narrate it not only in these state-sanctioned terms, but also in a novelistic framework, as event-centred, goal-oriented, intentional, and culminating in epiphanies or major transformations. The logic of time as productive thereby becomes one of serial cause and effect. The past seems useless unless it predicts and becomes material for a future. These teleologies of living in turn structure the logic of a people's inheritance rather than just the transfer of private property along heteroproductive lines. Inheritance becomes the familial and collective legacy from which a group will draw a properly political future, be it national, ethical or something else. And so we're back actually into our novelistic framework, the framework that Welty identifies and which oral historians are familiar with. And this is what I've called in my work the life equation. this plus this plus this equals me as I sit before you today, as I compose myself in an interview. And also just keep in mind this issue of inheritance, which I'll hopefully refer back to. So just to recap, what we have here is a system by which certain life events come to be held as key benchmarks of attainment. We could also add into these ones, the ones outlined here, we could add markers of education such as high school, university, graduation, entering the workforce. And all of these markers of attainment are recognisable in the skeleton which underpins the composition of a chronological narrative in an oral history interview. And I hope that some of the issues that this may pose for LGBTQ narratives are already becoming obvious, in that there is a distinctly heteronormative bent to all this. Freeman, coming from a Marxist perspective earlier, would argue that this heteronormativity is a result of the emphasis on productivity of the human body and of the human being. So in the first instance, chrononormativity may prohibit the narrating of LGBTQ narratives, in that this hierarchy of attainment does not make space for, or perhaps more accurately, space which can confirm the success of, a queer life that does not feature marriage, having children, creating the domestic idyll. If a narrative is told which features the rejection of these markers of attainment, according to Freeman et al., this rejection will have to be read as failure in any and all discourses underpinned by chrononormativity. And if any of you are familiar with Judith Halberstam's work on the queer art of failure, I think this would prove an interesting jumping off point into that work. So as I mentioned, communication studies tells us that women are the keepers of the events of domestic life, recorders of births, marriages and deaths, the ones who pivot the centre to present a life lived via connections and relationships. And Freeman has something very useful to say which corroborates that and links it specifically to how chrononormativity structures women's lives and narratives. And referring to John Gillis's concept of the ritualisation of family life, she says the family, in short, was no longer comprehensible through the rhythms of its labour and Sabbath keeping, but manifested itself through its own separate hourly, daily, weekly and yearly calendar of leisure activities. Once families began to be defined by clocked rituals and schedules, Gillis writes, one could say that family was put into cultural production, representing itself to itself in a series of daily, weekly and annual performances. And domestic photography became an integral part of this shift. As Hirsch writes, it both chronicles family rituals and constitutes a primary objective of those rituals. Family time, as it emerged, moved a formerly religious ritual time into women's domain. So women remember, apparently, stories of the home and the family, and women narrate those stories of the home and the family. But what does that mean for lesbian women? Well, of course, for the women that I've interviewed who were living as lesbians in the post-war period, for those who were in lesbian relationships, they weren't able to have children, so that rules that part out. But more generally, and I think much more importantly, they were often living those domestic lives in secret. Having a relationship with a woman, living with a woman, often buying a home together, but projecting something entirely different to the outside world. And so when they narrate their experiences of that life, they're telling the story of a dual existence, one in which they are outwardly failing in not achieving marriage, children, cosy domesticity, but in which they may actually have been living a conventional domestic monogamous life, albeit with a woman. And so that central relationship from which communication studies says a woman would pivot the centre in order to tell you her life story actually has to be kept hidden. The domestic world, the one in which women are given autonomy over that ritualisation, that cannot actually be disclosed. That acceptable female domain is closed off as a topic of conversation or as a way through which to relate to the world. And of course, anybody who's ever been in the closet on any level at all knows this all too well. You don't have access to those conversational conventions which facilitate social bonding. For a closeted person living a gay life, the seemingly harmless phrase, "What did you do at the weekend?" can be fraught with danger. Freeman remarks on the role of photography and home video in recording this ritualisation of women's domain. But of course, if you're closeted, if the relationship you come home to cannot be shared beyond that home, what function do family snaps serve other than to potentially come back to haunt you? Even in the home, it may not be safe to display such announcements of your relationship. For many women I spoke to, the home was not necessarily a safe space in which to live out their relationship. It was much more dualistic than that. Visitors threatened the secrecy of the relationship, whether it was family, work colleagues, neighbours, friends, or to the point where those people couldn't actually be invited to the home, again causing that schism. What about for lesbian women who did achieve those heteronormative markers of attainment? I interviewed women, numerous women who had been married, who had had children, who had lived that domestic life, but who were living a different kind of dual life in that they were hiding from their lesbian selves. Many women entered into marriage all the while knowing they were attracted to women. And these women perhaps do have all those jigsaw pieces to build that picture of a domestic idyll, They have the family photo albums to prove it. But for them, none of this necessarily helps to achieve composure in the oral history interview. In fact, it may actively prohibit it. If we think of that life equation, A plus B plus C equals me, it can be very destabilising and challenging for a narrator to explain the lesbian self they present in the interview whilst having to effectively reconcile it with that very alien life previously lived in heteronormative conformity. And this can in fact result in what can be termed narrative rupture, where the narrative is jeopardised by inherent contradiction and inconsistency. I want to reflect on my own oral history work in the light of all this. I'm an oral historian by accident rather than by design, which I think is true of a lot of oral historians. And it was something that was suggested to me as I was formulating my PhD project, came out of left field, seemed interesting, and so I went with it. And I had no idea at that point how theoretical oral history could be, completely naive about the whole thing. Luckily for me, that was something that I got really excited about and came to form a big part of my work. But now, looking back, particularly in the early days of my interviewing experience, I can see the huge potential for problems, which leaves me asking to what extent I failed to provide a space in which my narrators could compose their life stories as lesbian women. Oral history theory and method tells us to put the narrator at ease as much as possible, ease into the interview comfortable, simple, easy questions. It also says that people deviate from chronology and not to challenge that. But in something like a life narrative interview, to guide the narrator sequentially through their life story in order to facilitate that composure project, which is what you're there to get, as Dawson would argue. Firstly, I'll admit that I fell into the trap that Freeman outlines, both in the early days of my interviewing and even as I came to hone my skills, and still even, a couple of weeks ago, I probably fell into the same trap. I realise now that when a topic is exhausted or the narrator seems to have reached the end of a thread, the power of chronology and narrative exert their force on me, and I seek to return to that very conventional skeleton of progression or attainment, accomplishment, of chronology, of those epiphanies, moments of transformation. I'm looking for a novelistic framework. I'll say, and then what happened? Despite my understanding of the difficulties of uncovering silence narratives, I still fell foul of that huge ideological apparatus which constructs the frameworks that define and delineate the ways in which we communicate our identities to each other. In my research, women who had realised their lesbian sexuality early in life and who had then gone about living actively lesbian lives were those who produced the most composed and coherent narratives. In the light of Freeman's writing, this can also be linked to those who, despite being in same-sex relationships, most closely mirrored that linear narrative of attainment. Realisation, relationship or ships, buy a house, settle down, participate as far as possible in a state-sanctioned chronology. Returning to the notion of intersubjectivity and my role in the creation of the interview, I have to question to what extent I facilitated those narratives of chrononormative achievement. Did my lines of questioning preclude or inhibit the telling of narratives that did not fit that mould? Was I myself stuck in the well-worn tracks of a novelistic framework? I put those down as rhetorical questions, but I don't know why, because the answer is definitely yes. Listening back, sometimes like, but the funny thing is, I think I'll probably still keep doing it. It's so difficult to undo that. I mentioned the coming out narrative and its prevalence in LGBTQ narratives. This, I think, is an excellent example of how every marginal discourse will ultimately create its own dominant discourse, partly for cohesion within that group and partly because there will always be a dominant discourse. Of course, the coming out narrative is so strong because it's such a common experience for LGBTQ people and one which can be shared to facilitate the social bonding that comes through a shared experience. But I'd also argue that part of its rise to dominance is that the coming out narrative is successful as a chrononormative narrative. It's about progress, linear movement, transformation, attainment, in the sense of placing oneself in the world as a unified entity. I interviewed years ago now a woman called Penelope, and it's always stuck with me. She directly acknowledged and challenged the authority of the coming out narrative, which, had I understood what I now understand, I would love to go back and speak to her again about this. But she just said, how people say, and then I came out and I was so happy? Well, then I came out and I was as miserable as sin. Moving sort of away from my own research experience into wider issues of queer oral history, I also wanted to mention an area of inquiry that I think demands attention and which I'm hoping to expand into this work. The line of thinking actually comes from my partner, and I've just stolen it off her, in response to some research that she did with trans women on commercial sex exploitation. She said I can have the example, so I'm publicly citing my source, and it's on the podcast as well. We both come from a very strong feminist research background. So I explained how in my research it had been very important for women to choose to be named or to be anonymous if they wish. For some people it was about putting themselves on the record. Others wanted to be anonymous, but perhaps wanted to use pseudonyms of their own choosing, perhaps pen names or other significant names that had been meaningful to them. So my partner went with this approach. And in the very first interview, just as they were filling out the paperwork, she said to this woman, "And what would you like to be called?" And this woman actually burst into floods of tears, and she was kind of like really taken aback. And she was like, "I've done I'm doing all my proper feminist stuff." But this woman said, "As a trans woman, I have to tell people what my name is, and this has become such a fraught thing for me. I've had to battle to have this name. This is my name, and now you're asking me what I want my name to be." And so, it's just this thing that she thought she was, being a proper good feminist and giving this woman autonomy over choosing her name. But, it just shows you that you have to be rethinking every time that you go into a new situation. How are we doing for time, Justin? Are we okay? I talked about how in life narrative interviewing, the practice suggests that you warm up by inviting the narrator to tell you about their childhood, their upbringing, their family life, growing up. And this is deemed a safe topic. I mean, when you think about this now, it just seems ridiculous. But this is it, right? How many oral historians are sitting in this room who start off at oral history with asking about, tell me about your childhood? And I suppose it's about tapping into ideas of nostalgia, and it also sort of allows a sensible chronological starting point, if you like, where it all began. However, despite the obvious difficulties of that for many, many people, if we just think specifically about queer lives, when it comes to interviewing trans people, particularly people who have transitioned, asking questions about childhood can be anything from distressing to confrontational to just irrelevant. Beginning with childhood risks taking the trans narrator back to a past that is directly at odds with the self that they are presenting in the interview. And in fact, beginning the interview in such a way risks narrative rupture right from the outset, and also risks alienation and the breakdown of the intersubjective relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. Also add to this the fact that many trans people, again, especially those who have transitioned or undergone any kind of medical intervention, have had to tell and retell these stories to the medical profession, which stands between them and any form of treatment, from hormones to surgery. And I don't have time to go into it here, but we can certainly talk about it afterwards. But the concept of trans narratives is in itself a very interesting one, I think. Coming back to the theme of dominant narratives within marginal discourses, the successful trans narrative is one which convinces the doctor, the psychiatrist, the authority that you are a proper trans person, one who should receive treatment. Going back to Freeman's point, here again we have dominant state-sanctioned narratives. So what can we do with all this? How can we queer the interview encounter? Well, as with many of my papers, I don't have a very good answer for you, but the kind of lines that I'm thinking about, there's just a few kind of points that I want to end on in terms of how we can take what we can from what Freeman is saying about chrononormativity, how it can perhaps be applied to queer oral history to just start to break down these structures, these ones, as I say, these very well-worn furrows that I myself constantly, despite my every other attempt not to, keep falling into. So, for example, is there queer potential in the sense of queer heritage, the passing on of family histories along the queer line and not the bloodline? In my interviews, I often kind of take on the role of a niece or grandchild or something like that. I get invited into these women's homes to sit around and be told the family history, if you like. These are not normally the stories that women might sit around and tell their kids. Many of them do have kids, but also many of them don't have kids. And so when I come into their homes to take their narratives, this can be about passing on a story to somebody who wants to listen and who will then pass it on again. So does queer oral history then give us the opportunity for a sense of queer lineage, the handing down of our past to people who want to listen? Although actually, come to think of it, grandkids don't usually want to listen to what their grandparents have got to say anyway. Or is there also something potentially queer in that unspecified intergenerational relationship? Not as simple as an aunt and a niece. There's a collection of work on oral history interviews, queer oral history interviews, called Bodies of Evidence, which has a couple of really good chapters looking at these kind of issues, looking at things like flirtation in the interview encounter. One chapter is about a woman interviewing her lover and another woman, and so there is a sort of a sexual frisson that goes through the interview, which obviously plays with our concepts of how a proper oral history should be conducted. And there's something about foregrounding our queer sexualities and the intermingling of friendship and flirtation. In one of my really early interviews, when I was very, very naive and green, I interviewed a woman called Hazel, who was 70 at the time, who was incredibly flirtatious with me throughout the whole interview. And it really is a hilarious interview. She was in the Navy, and she was in the Wrens, and she had quite a good time, I think, in the kind of 50s and 60s in the Wrens. She was just such a flirt, and she really played up the Lothario figure. So does this then enact a queer scenario? Freeman also talks about queer time, citing Halberstam and others, and its resistance to the linear and its focus on repeating. And she mentions Kristeva's cyclical time as women's time. So by destabilising the sense of progeny and lineage, by injecting a sexual frisson across the generations and across that queer family, are we then creating the opportunity for queer narratives to emerge? I just want to finish up by saying we're at a really interesting moment in time in terms of queer narratives as well, in that in this period of equal marriage, what some may call the assimilation of equal marriage in the equality agenda. As someone who's worked in the equalities sector and who's worked in academia, I've kind of seen two sides of this coin. But the issues around same-sex marriage, tax breaks, parenting, all these kind of things that are on the agenda for LGBT people at the moment, is this also a sense of buying into chrononormativity via equal marriage, etc., by making us into kind of productive units? I'm not saying I agree with this, I'm just throwing it out because I thought it would be kind of a contentious way to end. But kind of taking us back to, right back to where Freeman starts, but taking us back to a bit of Marx, are we, in terms of this assimilation of wanting to sign up to, give me the equal marriage, give me the white dress and the top hat and whatever, give me the country house, then give me the domestic idyll, give me that package. Are we then in actual fact just reconstructing and rebolstering that sense of chrononormativity that sits at the heart of a person's life story if they tell a story that fits into this assimilationist framework? In the light of these changes, as queer oral historians, how are we going to continue to try not to fall into these traps again and again and again of telling me, oh, and so then you met your husband, okay, how did that happen, and what was your wedding like? Ooh. I'm being facetious, but there is a sensible, serious point somewhere underneath all this, that we are at a moment in time where queer theory has given us all these tools, but we're also at a moment in time where perhaps LGBT people's narratives have never been more closely aligned to what Freeman would term chrononormative. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.